In the early days of UFC, there was one name that stood out. One man who redefined the idea of a fighter, Tank Abbott. Known for his explosive aggression and larger-than-life persona, Abbott wasn't just a competitor in the cage. He was a force of nature that brought chaos, excitement, and raw power to every fight. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a showman. Someone who understood the spectacle of the sport long before it became mainstream. Today, we're diving into the career and legacy of one of UFC's most unforgettable personalities. Welcome to Iron Arena. Let's dive into the story of Tank Abbott. Early life. Tank Abbott's journey to UFC greatness didn't start in a gym or a dojo, but on the tough streets of Huntington Beach, California. Born into a working-class family, Abbott had to quickly learn how to take care of himself. From a young age, he wasn't just playing football or participating in traditional youth sports. Tank was already learning the art of survival in the streets. It wasn't uncommon for him to find himself in fights just to prove he could stand his ground. As a teenager, Tank wasn't focused on becoming a professional fighter. His early life was full of challenges, but also, like many of his generation, he was searching for something that would define his life. Unlike most fighters, Abbott didn't have the benefit of a structured athletic background. Instead, his training was street fighting, trial and error on the pavement. Tank never trained in wrestling or boxing. Instead, he brawled. This raw, unrefined approach to fighting would eventually define his fighting career in the UFC. While many fighters spent years perfecting their craft, Tank's training was all about street-smart toughness and the ability to take and deliver damage without hesitation. Arriving in the UFC. When Tank Abbott made his UFC debut, the sport was still in its wild, untamed stage. The UFC was bare-knuckle fighting, with few rules and even fewer regulations. The UFC was in the process of discovering itself, and fighters like Abbott were key to its evolution. While the sport lacked the structure of modern MMA, Abbott fit perfectly into the chaos. His brash personality, explosive aggression, and raw fighting style were exactly what UFC fans needed to see in the early days. Tank didn't come from a background of amateur wrestling or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Instead, his fighting style was built on raw power and the ability to create chaos inside the cage. His debut wasn't just about proving he could fight, it was about making a statement. Abbott was ready to fight anyone, anytime, and he wasn't about to play by anyone's rules. Winning was only part of the equation for Tank. Entertaining the fans was equally important.
No, that was Matua.
No. Matua laid out.
That was the stand-in for Shamrock.
The UFC 6 tournament. Tank Abbott's true breakout moment came at UFC 6, where he stepped into the octagon not as a favorite, but as a fighter with a reputation for his wild unpredictability. The tournament format at UFC 6 allowed fighters to showcase their skills in a series of brutal one-night matches. Tank entered this tournament like a tornado, aggressive, chaotic, and impossible to stop. In his first match, Tank faced John Matua, a towering opponent who outweighed him significantly. But Abbott didn't care. He took Matua out in under a minute. This wasn't a fluke. It was a statement. Tank Abbott wasn't just here to compete. He was here to dominate. He bulldozed through the tournament, leaving opponents in his wake, and in doing so, he helped bring the UFC to the forefront of people's attention. UFC 6 became one of the most memorable nights in early UFC history, not because of its technique, but because of the pure violence and explosive fighting. The intensity of Abbott's performances was exactly what fans wanted to see, and it set the stage for Tank to become one of the first superstars of the UFC. Tank Abbott's persona. One of the biggest aspects of Tank Abbott's success wasn't just his fighting style. It was his persona. Tank Abbott was a bad boy brash, loud, unapologetic, and ready to stir up drama. He didn't just want to fight, he wanted to create a show. In a sport that was just finding its audience, Tank understood that UFC wasn't just about fighting, it was about entertainment. Tank was one of the first fighters to understand that, to make it in UFC, you needed to stand out. While other fighters focused on technique, Abbott was all about the theatrics. Whether it was his outspoken trash talk, his intense stare-downs, or his wild antics before a fight, Tank Abbott made sure that no one could ignore him. His personality, just like his fighting, was larger than life. Fans loved him or hated him, but either way, they were drawn to him. Tank knew how to make people care about the fight, whether it was through his in-your-face attitude or the way he built hype around his bouts. This was a time when UFC was just beginning to realize the importance of entertainment, and Tank was a perfect match for that vision. The UFC evolution to transition entertainment. As time went on, UFC began to evolve. The no-rules brawls of the early UFC events were replaced with more structured, technical bouts. Fighters began to focus on developing their well-rounded skill sets, mastering a variety of martial arts to become MMA specialists. The days of pure street brawling were fading, and fighters like Tank Abbott, with their raw power and brash style, began to seem out of place in this new UFC. For Abbott, this shift was tough. The UFC had begun focusing more on strategy, technique, and finesse, while Tank's strength lay in being a wild brawler. His lack of technical development started to show, and he struggled to keep up with the more well-rounded fighters who were dominating the sport by the late 90s. Though Tank was no longer the centerpiece of UFC, his entertainment value continued to make him an important figure in the sport's history. Even as UFC evolved, Tank's larger-than-life persona continued to influence the direction of the sport, helping to transition UFC from a pure fighting spectacle into an entertainment-driven sport that combined fighting with showmanship. What happened? As UFC continued to evolve, so did its fighters. And unfortunately for Tank Abbott, the evolution left him behind. While other fighters focused on becoming more well-rounded, Tank's aggressive brawling style couldn't keep up with the more technical approach. Fighters like Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, and Tito Ortiz were rising to prominence, and Tank struggled to adapt. By the late 90s, Abbott's time in the UFC was dwindling. His legendary persona had started to fade as the sport became more refined. Tank's style, though exciting, became a liability against more disciplined fighters. His outdated style started to fail him in the cage, and the losses started to pile up. Tank Abbott's career in the UFC wasn't just about wins and losses. It was about impact. He had been part of the first generation of UFC stars who helped lay the foundation for what the sport would eventually become. While his career may have fizzled, Tank Abbott's influence on UFC's early days cannot be underestimated. Legacy and final thoughts. Tank Abbott's legacy is undeniable. He was one of the original pioneers of UFC. Even though he wasn't a champion in the traditional sense, he set the stage for the explosive personalities that would follow. His raw aggression, unpredictable fighting style, and larger-than-life persona helped to transform UFC from a chaotic spectacle into the sport we know today. Tank Abbott proved that sometimes it's not about being the best fighter or the most technical. Sometimes it's about creating a legacy that lives on long after you've left the cage. His contribution to UFC's rise cannot be overstated. His legacy remains one of the wildest, most entertaining, and most unforgettable chapters in the history of mixed. Abbott's story is one of raw power, uncompromising personality, and unforgettable moments. his legacy in the UFC is cemented. And while the sport may have moved on from the chaos and brawls of the early days, Tank Abbott will always be remembered as one of the fighters who helped define the UFC in its infancy. Thanks for watching Iron Arena. If you enjoyed, hit the like button, subscribe, and don't forget to click the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. Drop a comment below and let us know which fighter you want us to cover next.